So I'm Ryan Grover. I'm the Sewell C. Curator of American Art here at the Biggs Museum. And In Fresh Air is one of the two most recent exhibitions that I've launched here at the museum. These were shows that I've been thinking about for a long while. We sort of played with ways to sort of highlight our Impressionist collections here at the museum in the past through different just through different strategies within the permanent collection galleries. But this was the first chance that I really had enough time on the calendar to try and bring a lot of our both plein air and Impressionist collections out into one exhibition. And I gotta say, it's been really, really fun. There are probably about 65 works on view within this show. We have added 20 of those within the last 10 years, which is really exciting for us. These are difficult works to come by. They can be very expensive. They can be really, really desirous within the market. And so to be able to add that many within the collection of a small institution like ours is, well, it's just really exciting. And I hope that you really take advantage of this opportunity to come and see all of these things together. Today, this is, the show covers both plein air, sort of the rise of the importance of plein air work within the American art scene, but then how that transitions into American Impressionism. So it's really a story that sort of spans the entirety of the 1800s and then goes into the 1900s as well. And what I'm going to show you today is really sort of the proliferation of plein air works, talking about what plein air is, talking about how artists, the ways that artists embraced it within the United States, and then to talk about the ways that the artists were taught in the US as well as in Europe to use plein air to create finished artworks. Sometimes the plein air work is a finished artwork within itself, but oftentimes it sort of helped to create something else, something that the artists themselves would sort of consider an exhibitable work of art. So technically speaking, let's talk just for a moment about plein air. What is plein air? So you can look it up you can Google it, but plein air is basically to paint outside. It's just a European term that says to paint out in open air. And plein air differs from traditional sort of painting techniques in that it brings artists out of the studio and into the climactic conditions that they're trying to represent in their finished works. So many landscape artists, the 1700s, 1800s, would spend a lot of their time in the studio creating works based upon notations, based upon their own experiences, based upon their imaginations, based upon the desires of their patrons in order to sort of create these individual works. But they were often painted somewhat in isolation, not necessarily, I mean, in controlled lighting situations, in the comfort basically of an interior space. And plein air had always existed with that tradition. So artists had always gone out into nature and made the notations that they then drew upon, that then would sort of influence them in the compositions that they would create within the studio. There were a lot of interest, of course, always in sort of drawing from the source, drawing from the actual materials that individuals were going to use. But plein air was really sort of considered a note-taking process. It was a way to kind of take sort of artistic captions, if you will, of a subject, and then to use those, to draw upon those basically in a studio. So they really didn't have the kind of street credibility. They didn't have the sort of artistic chops. They weren't collectible. They weren't what people were interested in. And ultimately they weren't what artists were showing. So there were a couple of artists in the 1600s and especially in the 1700s in France, in Italy, eventually in England, that decide that they are going to emphasize plein air work. They wanted to sort of influence their paintings even more with a greater degree of direct observation from nature. And And that starts to become hugely influential within the academy systems within Europe. Those academy systems, those sort of methods of teaching became incredibly important here at the end of the 1700s and then throughout the 1800s. So the idea of plein air within America is a very sort of progressive, quietly stumbling forward kind of force in America, or in American art, especially American landscape painting. What does plein air do? So you go outside in nature and you take your supplies with you and you set up an easel, or perhaps you set up a chair and put it in your lap. But more than likely, you try and create some sort of device that allows you to kind of observe the natural world. And then you try to depict that natural world with as much fidelity as you're possibly able to. You are trying to capture the sun at a particular angle. You're trying to capture the shadows. You're trying to capture the true colors that you are observing in nature as it's happening. You're trying to observe atmosphere. So you're trying to figure out what's the cloud cover like? Are you looking through mist? What sort of atmospheric, like what kind of perspective in atmosphere are you trying to give in order to create a sense of depth within your landscape? What seasonal colors are you bringing to the forefront? What kinds of, what shapes are you making? And how do you capture all of this in a really, really short period of time to be true to that moment? How do you take a snapshot in paint while you're on view? And so these are the issues around plein air. This is sort of the difficulty of plein air. The other thing that we have to keep in mind is that plein air really starts to develop both in Europe and in America with the rise and importance of watercolor painting. Watercolors have been around for a really long time. People have been using water-based medium in the artwork for forever, but collectors, the patron base in Europe and in America, preferred works in oil. This is what they wanted to buy. These were the portraits and landscapes and still lifes that they wanted to kind of create. And oil paint at this time, until the advent of the Industrial Revolution, these paints were ground by hand by assistants and artists in their studios. They were difficult to produce, they were expensive to produce, and they were not portable. So you ground just the oil paint that you were going to use in a particular day of painting, and you typically did not do it outdoors. It just wasn't really practical. Or you move around with all of these little ceramic and glass dishes of oil paint. But watercolors were already being produced in little loaves, and you were able to transport those dry little loaves to locations, and all you needed was a little bit of water. Watercolor, especially outdoors, dries very quickly. So whatever kind of layering techniques or wet and wet processes that you're trying to initiate within those paintings, they dry pretty quickly. So you're able to move and create successive patterns, layer pattern onto your artwork relatively quickly. Still able to capture those very specific climatic conditions that you're trying to achieve in the paper. So a lot of plein air work is watercolor until a certain point when industrial minds invent oil paints that can be transported. But we'll get to that. So I'm going to move you over here to have a little bit more of a discussion about what plein air work is. This is the earliest work that's in the show, and this is not exactly a plein air work, but it helps to organize our thoughts around what is plein air or what is not plein air, and to sort of start to differentiate that. Not all plein air work was exclusively painted outdoors. Some of it was started there and then finished within a studio. Sometimes it wasn't always painted in one sitting. Sometimes artists returned with the same composition to the same spot multiple days in a row and finished a complete work. And then sometimes the work is influenced by plein air work, but it's also really, really heavily influenced by person's imagination. And I think that's kind of what's happening here. So with this particular image, this is an image from about 1812. We don't know who the artist is, but this is a spot in Lower Manhattan in 1812, which is super great. And you can sort of imagine yourself as the artist standing in this sort of covered patio space, and you recognize that everything in this covered patio space is completely shaded. But directly beyond that shaded porch, is a sun-drenched environment. And so the attention that is being placed by this artist, whoever they may be, on the angle of the porch, the precision that is being given to the architectural rendering, even rendering it with a few missing spindles here within the cabinetry, the placement of all of the boards that make up the roof, even the placement of the nails, if you can make out the details. So the actual lines of nails that were holding these boards in place. And the beautiful contrast of the shaded area against this brightly lit world outside of this architecture. All of this indicates plein air work. All of these are strong indications that somebody was on site and observing this in great detail. Now, parts of this also show that other parts of what is depicted here is not plein air. So after the porch was painted, somebody decided to paint in a dog. And you can actually see the seam of the watercolor here. This dog is probably not on site when this was being painted. This was probably added later. Notice the trees and the textures, the sort of uniform texture of these trees and these kind of weird geometric shapes that they make. This is not plein air. This is, but it's very decorative. And even the people that you're seeing depicted, there's something sort of, I don't know, sort of simplified and cartoonish, something that is kind of stylized, just as stylized as these super fluffy white clouds in the background, also not plein air. Part of this is, drawn from reality, clearly, but part of this is also somebody's invention. So there is this distinction that's being created, at least within this picture, about what would constitute plein air and what would come from someone's imagination. So this work is by a guy named William Thompson Russell Smith. He is from Pittsburgh, I think, originally, was known as a set designer, ended up moving to Philadelphia, became a professional painter. But this is an early work. This is a plein air study. We believe it's a plein air study of the spot north of Philadelphia where he and his wife would eventually build a house. He's admiring this space. He's trying to sort of record basically the position of these features, like the position of trees and the fence line. He is recording the coloration of the sky. He's working very quickly. You can see that he's working wet and wet, which means that he wets the paper, drenches the paper, and then just drops in these little bits of pink and blue and yellow into the sky to create this really diffuse and very sort of watery texture of the paint. The same thing is happening within the tree line, except that it is also somewhat bordered by this ink line that sort of silhouettes and defines basically the bushes. So the tree is then, so the ink is placed in, the tree is then painted the pale green, and then while it's still wet, he drops in these dark green low lights into the shadow, basically, into the tree. It's terrific. It's fast. It probably took him way less than an hour to produce. And it records with, I think, a lot of accuracy, the coloration, the setting sun, the position of these trees, the colors, the idea of silhouette, all of this is sort of recorded. However, this is not a work that the artist was necessarily going to share with his clients. This is not necessarily a work that they were interested in trying to sell, but it was probably one of hundreds, if not thousands, of drawings that this person would have made during their career that they would then draw upon to create exhibitable work. What does exhibitable work mean? So and we'll get to this a little bit, but just to give you an idea, this is work that would have been publicly presented, either in their studio or in grand competitions, or to a patron that came to try and find out more about the artist. They probably wouldn't have focused as much on these little sketches, these watercolor drawings, as they would on the finished works. So we're going to move a little bit further down the road here. This is the work by James Hamilton. He was a marine painter associated with the Delaware River, the Delaware Bay. We have a few works by him here in the museum, and he's terrific. You don't really find a lot of his watercolors. That's also one of the interesting things about some of these plein air studies of the 19th century, is that a lot of these never make it to the market. Sometimes the artists destroy these because they aren't necessarily what they are interested in being remembered for. And so to find these little studies, here we're seeing a study of light shining through the clouds onto the shipwreck here on what is probably the Delaware Bay, Delaware River, perhaps somewhere in the neighborhood of Philadelphia to Wilmington. In the background, you can kind of see a second coastline. So we might be looking at some place where you are able to see the New Jersey coastline. But he has quickly sort of roughed out this the sketch of the shipwreck. And he includes a characteristic that I think happens a lot in plein air work. Because this is a artwork where this is a sort of a technique that is meant to be something of a snapshot for people, there is this inclination to try and include moving objects in the subject. Now, this piece is done in around 1844, so it's not yet being influenced by photography, but that photographic notion of capturing the moment, capturing movement, capturing sort of the excitement of a particular scene is already kind of in the air. And people are focused on this idea in plein air about capturing sort of moving features in that landscape. In a way, it sort of offers a level of authenticity to the image, but ultimately, I think it's kind of a, what's the word I'm looking for? It's kind of a challenge to the artist to capture this boat in motion, the details of the artist, the rippling water, the reflection of colors, and to, again, to be faithful in that application, to sort of, to get it right. So we saw a rough sketch. We saw in James Hamilton probably some kind of preparatory sketch or something that, again, would be influential upon a final work. But here with Isaac Williams, we are seeing what is probably a more finished watercolor painting that is also probably at least based in the plein air tradition. This is something that I want you to kind of focus on in the sort of rise of what the watercolor school. In the 1800s, there are American artists that are training with other artists or in American academies, like in the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts in Philadelphia. And they are being introduced to a variety of different media and subjects. But watercolor amongst those art instructors is beginning to increase in importance. I can't say that there are many watercolors in the mid-1800s that are being exhibited in large-scale competitions. However, there are organizations, artist clubs that are beginning to develop in the United States around the watercolor medium. And so you start to see these clubs of artists coming together and holding their own competitions specifically with the watercolor medium. And that's definitely at play with Isaac Williams. If he isn't actually an active member of these watercolor clubs, he is aspiring to be. We actually have a remarkably good collection of Isaac Williams' work, and that was because Isaac Williams' father, who, if I remember correctly, was a dentist in Philadelphia, bought a gentleman's farm outside of Middletown. So this was like, this would be like a weekend retreat or a place that someone might spend a summer. But especially for a busy business guy in Philadelphia. But, and it was a farm, it was a working farm, but he himself was not sort of a commercial farmer. He would hire people, they would grow things, they would kind of sell things, but really it was just kind of a pleasure space. Isaac Williams would start coming to Delaware at his father's farm and the countryside in the first half of the 1800s, and he created some of the earliest depictions of Delaware landscapes, especially outside of Wilmington, that we have in record. And we have quite a few pieces. Now, interestingly, a lot of these were watercolors. A lot of these were never intended to be sold out of the family. A lot of them are sketches, and we'll show you a couple of examples of those in a little bit. They were probably influential on the oil paintings that he did exhibit. However, this watercolor that you see is really, really refined. It's heavily developed. You can see the amount of patterning that's being placed in the tiny, tiny brush strokes of the foreground. You can see the amount of attention that's being placed in the sun or in the cloud formations, the colors, the sort of delicate and tiny. This, I mean, overall, I don't know if you probably get a perspective of this when we were coming up, but it's only about a foot wide by about 5 inches tall. This is a very small painting, and the amount of detail that's being depicted here is really remarkable. I love this work, and I love this guy's work. He also worked in Philadelphia. He was a portrait painter. I've only seen a few of his portraits. I'm not that impressed, between you and me. But he also did a lot of architectural renderings in Philadelphia, which I have not seen, but I understand that I think that they're in the collection of the Free Library. Isaac Williams, where it's at, it's great stuff. Okay, so Frederic de Berg Richards, early photographer, fine art photographer, portrait photographer in Philadelphia, kind of semi-retires to the marshlands on the east coast of New Jersey and sells plein air depictions of those marshes for a great portion of his life, later life. This is a really beautiful, really delicate kind of painting of these scenes that he was particularly well known for later in life. I'm not even sure what to say about this. You know, the interesting thing about this work is that it has been reduced and the paint was applied so quickly and in such delicate nature that it really sort of abstracts the landscape. You're not even necessarily sure exactly where the horizon is. You have this sense of like rolling atmosphere, just rolling into sort of a limitless space and then rising into this really delicate cloud coverage. The colors are, it takes a while to sort of adjust your eye to the fact that the colors are really vibrant. There's a vibrancy and sort of a beauty to these things, but the colors are all, there's this overall subtlety to the piece that is really, really emblematic of his work. Super moody, I love it. Now, one of the reasons to come and see this show is because this is watercolor. We do not get to view these very often. We do not get to put these out very often. Really, I shouldn't be putting them out more than a couple of weeks a year, and they should be resting in the dark the rest of the time. So to have them all out is a really, really good reason to come. The other thing that's happening here is that a lot of these pieces that we're looking at today were purchased by the museum's founder, Sewell Biggs, for the museum as it was forming, but a number of them have been gifted to the museum by Dick and Elise Poole, collectors. They were once collectors in the sort of Delaware area, Wilmington and Rehoboth. Really, really great folks, very, very supportive of the museum. But a lot of these were gifted by them, and we have only sporadically been able to really share them. So to have all of them out at once is kind of a dream come true. Keep following. So this work is by a guy named Whitteridge. I think it's Thomas Worthington Whitteridge. And he was a Hudson School painter. This is work from about 1865. And this is an oil painting. So this is oil on panel, if I remember correctly. And this was more than likely a plein air composition. This is a plein air study. And it's a little bit different than some of the works that we've seen. It's more of a forest interior spot. There is a great attention on capturing the scene of these trees as silhouetted with the light coming in from behind them. And notice also that there's great attention in creating these sort of sun dappled areas along the river stream. So it becomes these sort of emphasis points, this sort of dramatic application of light within the space. And I love this painting. We have this painting out all the time. I should sort of like actively pursue ways to be able to like put it on postcards and such. But again, this, even though this is a work in oil, this is probably not what would have been considered sort of a finished work. Perhaps this is a work that would have been sold, but more than likely this was a study or some sort of practice work towards a more finished composition. This has a pretty remarkable level of finish. This was an artist that was very adept at being able to paint both in broad brush strokes, like what you see here, the quick application of these sort of rushing water, as well as this sort of more delicate, dry approach to these branches and sort of these sort of crossing sticks and boards, or not boards, excuse me, these sort of sticks and branches sort of I don't know, almost sort of touching each other in the background. It's really, it's a really lovely piece. No, so how is this possible? Again, artists were able to, or excuse me, paint manufacturers were able to start producing synthetic paints. And then, why synthetic? Well, it allowed you to create chemical compositions for paints that would then be able to be reproduced with great fidelity over and over and over again. So the green that you purchased last year will be pretty much the same green that you buy next year. And again, because they are transportable, these oil paints were packed in small metal tubes, and that meant that they were fresh for a very long period of time. I'm going to bring you right down here to these three pieces. These three works are done by a guy named Edmund Darch Lewis, and Lewis had a pretty he got rich off of his paintings really early in his career, his landscape work, and people sort of collected him pretty heavily. Later in life, he was known, and by later in life, I mean sort of like the second half of his career, he wasn't as interested in trying to exhibit. He didn't want to do the large scale competitions. He did travel. So he used the money that he had to travel pretty extensively. He started collecting pretty extensively. And I'm trying to remember, but I think that his base, like the basis of his, like where he had his home was in New York City. However, so he traveled to these locations. We have Cape May, we have Niagara Falls, we have probably a location in New Jersey at the bottom. And he seems to have created a great number of watercolors, so water-based media on paper. And the paper is almost always in these long sort of panoramic format. I don't know, perhaps one of you know, let me know if you do know, pads of paper at this time probably would have come in pre-cut sheets. And I'm feeling like he was using a very specific pad of watercolor paper, again, another kind of industrial product, so that when he was traveling, so this is the 1880s, 1890s, already the railroads were in place. He's traveling by rail. He's able to travel with an easy watercolor set, and he is probably painting as he goes. I know that his brother lived in Cape May. There are many depictions of Cape May that he comes back to over and over again. And here we see him using both watercolor as well as this chalky white gouache. Watercolor is usually sort of taught that you start with the lightest colors in your composition and then you work with up to the darkest, because the watercolor is not opaque. everything is sort of, every layer is slightly translucent. So you need to use your most opaque paints, the darker colors last. But then you can also use this gouache, which has a kind of chalk in it that creates this opacity, but it's really only good for white. So, and some watercolorists would say that, would be real purist about the whole thing and say, well, you can't use that. You can only use the white of the paper. So you decide how you want to go about that. But it is a water-based medium anyways, and lots of watercolorists did use it. Edmund Darch Lewis, this particular image that you see with Cape May is kind of sketch-like, so you can see the actual brushstrokes, you can see him sort of quickly moving across this. But other images like Niagara Falls above it is very heavily detailed, and you can sort of see that he really labored on the subject for a much longer period of time. So here, and you can take my word for it, but come see the brushstrokes of the water application, the formation of the rocks, much, much smaller, much, much more detailed. Isaac Williams, so returning back to Isaac Williams. We have some watercolor sketches, some very, very simple watercolor sketches of Isaac Williams working in the Middletown, Delaware, sort of like the southern Newcastle County area in fall and in spring. And they're on view in this case right next door to us. But these simple little watercolors that we saw, and you can sort of get a feel for that with a much more detailed example that I showed you earlier. You can see how these sort of small scale pieces might have been used as ways to be able to, notations about the use of light, the color, the kinds of trees, the shape of the land, the elements that you find on the land, both flowers and animals and types of people and whatever the case may be, but all of the different subjects that you're depicting within this landscape really come to play when you create larger scale compositions like what you see here. This piece is called Pastoral Landscape, and it's from, well, we don't know the date on this one, but we're probably looking at it somewhere just before the American Civil War. And you look at his depictions, the watercolors that he creates of the Delaware landscape, and this could very well be Delaware, this could be Pennsylvania, but the important thing to say is that he is creating a fantasy of a landscape based upon his observations and his plein air studies that he created on site. So was he out there with this particular canvas depicting these cows? No, he totally was not. But he was in his studio with several watercolors of cows that he had encountered, and perhaps he incorporated them. Perhaps he saw this twisted tree. Perhaps he saw this little break in the water. Perhaps he saw this, these colors of light and sky that permeate this particular piece of painting. And so he drew upon those notes in order to be able to create a work that then was exhibited at the annual competition, basically at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. Large-scale paintings like this by Isaac Williams are very rare. So this is what a lot of plein air work became in this time period. And we had talked a little bit, or I had talked because I blather on, we had talked a little bit about how American artists would start their education in America, but perhaps they would go to Europe in order to finish their education in the 1800s. And this happened for a much longer period of time. A lot of students, I'm just going to move this bench out of the way 1 second. A lot of students would travel to England, Italy, Germany, France, and they would study with well-known masters in any of those spaces, but they would also enroll in classes at the art academies in a lot of those spaces. And each of those countries, or I should say principal academies in each of those countries, used plein air studies in different ways. So the plein air tradition that was being cultivated was being utilized in different culturally specific ways in landscape. And so American artists would have learned about those distinctions between sort of British traditions in landscape painting versus French traditions in landscape painting, or German techniques, either by traveling to those countries and studying with artists of those nationalities, or by studying with artists who had studied there themselves. This could be German immigrant painters in Philadelphia, like Carl Weber, the first painting that we saw in the show. Or this could have been artists who they themselves trained there and then brought those techniques back to America. So I'm just going to sort of roll through a couple of examples of our American artworks that were produced using these different sort of culturally specific techniques. So follow me. We see Thomas Cole on your right and James Hamilton once again here on your left. And both of them are following different techniques that happened in British landscape traditions. Thomas Cole was known to work in nature a lot. He studied in nature, did plein air studies all the time, never exhibited his plein air studies, but always, as he was developing the whole notion of American landscape paintings in the Hudson River Valley, he was using his notations to create, Isaac Williams in a few years after him, total fantasies. So he probably observed a mountain of similar size and shape. He probably observed a river with a waterfall. He probably observed this sort of twisted, gnarled tree that you see here. Did he see them all together? Is this a recognizable location? No. But it talks about the untamed American wilderness of the first half of the 1800s. And it was created through a series of studies that he would have created throughout his entire career. These studies become kind of a dictionary of visual elements that you can add to a painting. And I wish that we had even more examples to show you how that translates. James Hamilton is also following another sort of tradition of British painting that was really started by William Turner and other individual painters about the dramatic use of paint. And sort of, so this is a very studied, knowledgeable idea about how color moves in water, but it's really sort of kind of heavily abstracted. It becomes these sort of wispy spews of water at the rocks and these kind of dark plummeting colors as you sort of look through the water. James Hamilton is studying what was happening in Niagara Falls. He was studying the subject intensely, but the application of the paints is really, really fast. And it's very dramatic and much in many of the ways that Turner's own work was. So much so that James Hamilton was called the American Turner. British traditions. Moving on, we're going to see some German influences. German painters also used a lot of plein air. They did a lot of observation of the work around them, of the worlds around them. They created lots and lots of studies of their own travels. But instead of trying to create utter fantasies, both through interesting painted techniques or through unrecognizable compositions, a lot of German painters used their notations to create paintings and compositions with exquisite amounts of detail. So in this Albert Bierstadt painting of Niagara Falls, you can see not only like the very specific shape of this particular area of the falls, but very specific rock formations, very specific types of trees, types of mineral deposits, and climatic conditions that he wanted to be able to share with you. This, as far as we know, is not a plein air work. However, we do know that this is one of 5 paintings that he created in the area of Niagara Falls while he was visiting his brother in this year. So there's an intense amount of study of these scenes that he is creating, but he is translating them very faithfully. And the same can be true of this other artist, Herman Herzog, that we have here to the left. Like the Darch Lewis paintings that we saw earlier, Herman Herzog had a lot of early success in Europe, sold paintings even to the czars of Russia. And with those monies, he came to America and traveled really extensively, painting all the way. And so he did plein air studies, got on trains, got into boats, and traveled all over America and made these really wonderful sort of memorializations, really, of the American landscape. And then I wanted to sort of start showing off the French influence. So the French had used plein air studies to kind of create neoclassically inspired, very, very classical kinds of landscape compositions. You didn't hear this from me, but it was kind of similar to what we saw with the British tradition, except that it was not long before the French really started to move forward with this idea of creating plein air artworks in oil paintings and watercolors, but that were in themselves finished compositions. And so this started with this desire of Parisian professional artists to get out of Paris, get on a train, and go to other locations. And so Fontainebleau and the forest at Barbizon are great, terrific examples of spaces that they congregated to get out of their studios, out of the urban environment, and into nature. Barbizon was happening really throughout the second half of the 19th century in really significant ways, larger and larger and larger numbers of artists going out there. Some of them were out to create sketches from life, but a lot of them went out there with their little tubes of oil paints and their whole canvases and went directly into nature and created plein air compositions that are very, very emblematic of the specific climate conditions that they confronted with these materials. So they went out and painted for a couple of hours max within one spot so that they could get the angle of the light, they could get the shadow, they could get the colors, they could get the weather conditions, they could get the humidity levels in the air, and they could start to work out these compositions. Now, if you haven't noticed this before, let me sort of be blunt about this. Plein air work is fast. It's really quick. This is not, these are not artworks that are created over, generally speaking, over weeks and months and months. This is not work that you're allowed to labor over. What is so exciting about plein air is that you are creating a fast impression of the subject, but you are not that focused on detail. You are using lots of fast applications of paint, very quick, very loose brushwork. You are recording forms very, very quickly. Your application of paint, the way that you place the paint down, and the color choices that you make in order to be able to record these particular scenes are more important than the subject themselves. Now, the work that you're looking at, these are American artists who went to France, studied at the academies, but then also found a great interest in what was happening in Barbizon. So followed French artists to the areas of Barbizon and started to study this tradition or this growing interest in painting plein air in oil paints. And so these Barbizon painters, these American Barbizon painters, really do start to bring that tradition of this loose brushwork, these brighter colors, this fast applications of paint, and this interest in creating finished works out in nature back to America. They start creating artist colonies near cities. So the Hudson Valley becomes a series of artist colonies start to develop in the Hudson Valley. You start to see it in Connecticut. You start to see it in Massachusetts, outside of Boston. You start to see it in Rehoboth Beach, Delaware. And plein air painting proliferates within those areas. Plein air painting will then sort of spread in America into what is called tonalism. It's kind of America's homebred reaction to Barbizon, and then into Impressionism, which takes all of these ideas about plein air and just sort of explodes them, turns them into this whole movement that sort of takes over Western culture in the biggest way. But that will happen next month. So you will have to come back to see it at that time.
Brian, we have one question that started coming in. Do you see, by comparison, the British influence is using much darker colors, a much cooler palette than the French influences? Is that purposeful, or does that just happen to be the artworks that we have up right now?
It's partly the artworks that we have up right now, but part of it also has to do with, well, there's two things happening here. Synthetic colors in the oil paints that you're taking to use in, that you're creating plein air work from, these are by nature brighter. They are sort of brighter colors overall. There were bright colors being produced by hand in artist studios before this, but they're really expensive. Synthetic colors are much less expensive. So people had more access to them. So the darkness that you might be perceiving with hand ground paints isn't necessarily as much of a concern when you're talking about Barbizon, and especially when you're talking about Impressionism. The color palette really brightens. And as soon as you walk into the next room with me, which you'll have to do in a month, you are going to instantly recognize that something has completely changed in terms of palette. But part of it also is the artist's intent. The plein air painters in Barbizon, they are trying to capture the elements of light much more so than Thomas Cole was. Thomas Cole used lights, in that painting that I showed you, he features the sun dead center, like he wants it to be a sort of compositional form. He wants it to be kind of a point of interest, but it's not necessarily something that dominates your understanding of the entire scene in these sun-drenched compositions.
Brian, can you remind us who the artist is of this painting you're standing in front of?
Of course, you're going to ask me. George Henry Smiley. It's an unfortunate name, I apologize. But he's a New York artist, and this is a view of the Bronx River. Any other questions?
We have one more. In this exhibition, you have mentioned a couple times and pointed out works on paper. Where do we keep works on paper here at the museum?
Oh, good question. We have a storage facility up on the second floor. So unframed pieces get kept into what we call cylinder boxes. They're sort of like these not airtight, but pretty tight and light tight upholstered boxes made with acid-free materials so that they're able to store in there without being off-gassed or being having any light. Framed pieces go onto our paintings racks. A number of these works, not the pieces that were given by Dick Poole, but a number of pieces that are in that were gifted to us by our museum's founder, Sewell Biggs, have been recorded in our collections catalog. So if there are things in the collections catalog that you would like to see, but are not on view, you can always make an appointment with me to come take a look at them.
All right, we have no more questions at this time, Ryan.
Okay, well, we have 2 minutes, so I'm going to give you a sneak peek at tonalism. I'm not going to talk about it. I'm just going to let you sort of pass over it so you have an idea where we're headed next week. So follow me. This is George Inness, A Glimpse of the Hudson from about 1880. And I just want you to sort of meditate on this piece, thinking about what we've just talked about in terms of plein air. And I'll just whisper that you should have a good night.
And from all of us here at the Bigs, we want to thank you for joining us tonight. And we hope you come back to see more of our tours and programs here at the Bigs Museum of American Art. Have a nice night, everyone.